Not Just a Family Tree, Landscape and Memory in the Surrey Archives by Julian Pooley, Heritage Public Services and Engagement Manager at Surrey History Centre in Woking. I'm sure that many of us of a certain age will remember the long hot summer of 1976, when there were seemingly endless weeks of hot sunshine, blue skies, and the temperature soared into the 90s every day. I was 13, and as usual spent my summer holidays with my grandparents at their tiny cottage on Gabbrook Common, in that magical stretch of country between Brockham, Betchworth and Lye. Summer was always a busy time for them. With only one fireplace in the living room to heat the cottage in winter, the summer months were spent gathering timber from the surrounding fields and woodlands to chop up and stack under a corrugated iron lean-to, so that it could season slowly for kindling and firewood. The wood that we gathered and chopped in 1976 was elm, the tall, majestic trees that had withstood the elements for centuries in the hedgerows and fields around the cottage had been decimated by Dutch elm disease and now lay stretched out and lifeless in the meadows surrounding their cottage. They provided rich pickings for my grandparents. But elm is a hard, unyielding wood, full of knots and heavy work for the axe and saw. My young hands soon blistered and hardened up. The long hours that we spent sweating over that elm by day, and later sitting quietly in the cottage doorway in the evening, drinking Granny's homemade wine, were full of stories about my grandparents' lives and hilarious tales about farming folk and friends. I heard of Grandad's life as a stud groom, walking shy horses from Surrey up to Yorkshire, through Essex and East Anglia. He'd been partly paid in beer, often drinking up to 30 pints a day, but he'd also found time to walk into a pub in Pleshy, where the girl who would be my grandmother was working in the bar. He taught me how to snare and prepare rabbits for a stew, how to lay a hedge and roll a cigarette with one hand. Granny also told me how, when sleeping off his beer under a tree, Grandad's faithful gun dog, trusted to retrieve illicit game, would stand guard, preventing Granny and their daughters from approaching to ensure he was okay. I hated history at school. As a teenager, dates and kings and battles meant very little to me. But the past was another matter, and in the shimmering heat of 1976, the stories and the elm trees merged together. As healthy trees, they'd provided shade for Grandad to sleep off his beer, and witnessed a country life that, through family tales and Grandad's rich repertoire of folk songs, stretched back deep into the 19th century. And now we were splitting their dead trunks and limbs apart. The bark was peeling away from the diseased dead wood, and the twigs we had discarded were snapping beneath our feet. I realised that there is much more to the past than just history. It's about people, lives and stories. The tools we were using to prepare the wood had been handed down over generations. Grandad even named particular tools after long-dead former owners. His long-handled pruning shears were called the Harold Swans because he borrowed them from Harold from Gadbrook Farm after a pint at the Barley Mow decades before, and Harold had never asked for them back. They and the trees in the landscape around us were tangible connections to a fascinating past. That's why I returned to history and became an archivist, and why I leapt at the opportunity to work at what was then Surrey Record Office when I spotted an advert in 1989. The manuscript letters, parchment estate maps, engravings, watercolours, early photographs, and rare printed books in our collections provide that same tactile link with past lives, and are crammed full of stories and anecdotes about the county, its people, and its landscape. And as Surrey is probably the most heavily wooded English county, trees figure prominently in our records. You can see trees on many of the historic maps that we hold, depicting landholding and the ownership of estates across the county. They were often drawn up when a property was sold or inherited, and so survive in the archives of Surrey's long-established families, the Moores, Brays, Onslows, Evelyns and Austins. Throughout the 16th century, as the gentry of Surrey became more involved in running the county, they grew keen to defend their titles, survey their estates, and trace their pedigrees. Many of them commissioned maps of their estates from skilled surveyors, and these maps often include trees. Here we see part of the large parchment map of the manor of Ham Court and other land in Chertsey and Weybridge that belonged to Charles, Earl of Portmore, in 1732. Meticulously drawn on prepared sheepskin and beautifully coloured, we can follow the course of the River Wey, winding between water meadows on its way to Weybridge Lock. We learn the names of the fields and can see the trees growing in their enclosing hedgerows. At the bottom right, we can see the formal walks and vistas afforded by the geometrically planned plantations of trees of Ham Court itself, along with the kitchen gardens and orchards. The surveyor of this map was Thomas Brown, an expert herald and member of the College of Arms, which probably explains the elaborately drawn heraldic crest in the bottom left. The map is as much a work of art as it is an historical document. Estate and family papers like this tell us a lot about trees. Here we see the planting plans for the avenues of trees at Charles Tryon's estate at Norbury, near Dorking, in 1731. It was surveyed by Tycho Wing, a member of an eminent family of makers of watches, scientific instruments, and also land surveyors. People visit us at Surrey History Centre in Woking from all over the world to use the Loseley manuscripts, a rich and internationally important family archive stored by generations of the Molyneux family at their home Loseley House, just a couple of miles southwest of Guildford. They acquired the estate in the early 16th century, and the present house was built by Sir William Moore between 1562 and 1568 to replace a smaller, earlier home which Queen Elizabeth had declared to be inadequate for her when she visited the county on one of her progresses. The vast archive accumulated by the family, including an important collection of letters, building accounts, and plans of the estate, was once stored in what was called the Evidences Room. During the Second World War, many of the papers were stored in cellars and were badly affected by damp. When the archive was finally removed to Guildford Muniment Room in 1950, the smell produced by the great mass of mouldering papers was likened by a conservator to that of a battlefield. An archivist who helped rescue the papers talked of deeds thickly coated with grey fur, such as one sometimes sees on jam, and paper bills stuck together in solid slabs. They're now safely deposited at Surrey History Centre, where our skilled conservator, Jeff Dowes, is continuing the work of successive conservation staff in preserving these wonderful documents. They include these plans by an anonymous surveyor for the planting of trees in avenues on the estate in the early 18th century. It's easy to imagine the Moore family poring over them and discussing their merits with their surveyor in the main hall of this beautiful Surrey home. The archive also includes this delightful view of the formal gardens designed for Loseley at around the same time. And there's also a much earlier, detailed manuscript list of the timber on the estate, identifying species of trees and the quantities that were grown, naming the labourers and the carpenters who cut, seasoned and prepared the wood when Loseley House was built in the 1560s. In this charming little book, wrapped in parchment and tied up with string, we can glimpse detailed notes of the quantities of timber harvested on the Loseley estate in the mid-17th century. It's well thumbed and a little bit grubby, and you can almost smell the sawdust of the woodyard as the estate manager rolled his notebook up in his pocket before inspecting the day's work. Lists like this remind us that the trees of Surrey were a highly valued commodity, worth going to court over if there was any doubt about their ownership. In January 1689, Sir Richard Heath of Hatchlands near Clandon was quick to fire off this letter to Sir John Nicholas about a particular tree standing on his land. It seems that Nicholas had made a claim to it, but Heath knew better, sharply pointing out that his grandfather had bought the acre of land on which it grew in the time of Queen Elizabeth. William Bray, a solicitor and local historian, was well aware of the value of trees. Born in 1736 into a family who had owned extensive land around the villages of Shear and Gomshall since his ancestor Sir Reginald Bray had been given the manor of Shear in 1486, he worked hard when he inherited the estate in 1803 to reclaim wasteland and develop forestry as an industry across the area. Much of the woodland that we enjoy today across the Surrey Hills area of outstanding natural beauty originated in the work of Bray and like-minded fellow landowners across this beautiful part of Surrey. His interest in trees can also be seen in the documents that he accumulated when researching his 3-volume History and Antiquities of Surrey, completed in 1814. They survive in the Bray Archive at Surrey History Centre and include this fascinating list of the parcels of coppice woodland at Titings Farm in St Martha's in the 1570s. The list is accompanied by this lovely little plan of the property itself, showing those coppices in detail, along with a church and a house and what appear to be gardens. Trees, like any crop, were bought and sold at auction. If you happened to pop into the King's Arms at Ockley at lunchtime on the 9th of April 1802, you could have bid for 2,806 trees scattered on various named farms around Ockley, Capel and Dorking. The 6 lots on offer were each made up of several hundred trees, many of them oaks, on farms tenanted by John Poltock, Nathaniel Braby and George Dendy. Small print identifies Mr. Wilson of Doughty Street near the Foundling Hospital in London as the surveyor. 10 years later, a large quantity of timber standing on Upper Tooting Common was sold by auction at the Horse and Groom public house run by Edward Bartlett in Streatham. And when Joseph Humphrey, a farmer at Titsey in the east of the county, died in the early 19th century, the oak trees and pollarded oak and ash trees on his land were totted up for the value they added to his estate. Their locations in this document give important information on local field names: Longmead, Pondfield, Broomyfield, and even timber-related activities in the area, with meadows named after saw pits. Of course, trees were found in Surrey's towns and urban areas as well. In this extraordinary engraving, called the Iconography of Guildford, made in 1739, we can see the narrow town garden stretching out behind the shops and houses lining Guildford High Street, the kitchen garden behind Abbott's Hospital, the old bowling green on what is now North Street, but in 1739 was called the Lower Back Side, and what appear to be orchards in the Free School Close at the bottom right of the picture, and again, above that, running along the side of lands owned by Sarah and Henry White. Notice the snail shell-like feature here. It's not a maze, but a raised ornamental earthwork to adorn the garden and admire the view. Surrey was once much larger than it is now, stretching along the River Thames from Kingston all the way to Rotherhithe. These parishes, including Ronsworth, Lambeth, Clapham and Southwark, were lost to the new county of London when it was created in 1889. But many records covering this area survive in our collections at Surrey History Centre, notably in the records of Surrey's Court of Quarter Sessions. This was the predecessor of Surrey County Council, made up of Justices of the Peace who met 4 times a year, at Epiphany, just after Christmas, Easter, Midsummer and Michaelmas at the end of September, in the county towns of Southwark, Reigate, Kingston and Guildford. Their records provide important evidence for trees in parts of the ancient county that have long since been swallowed up by the metropolis. They include detailed plans of proposed undertakings such as canals, turnpike roads and railways that were drawn up to show any properties that might be affected by the proposed development. Few of these proposals would have been carried out. They were simply part of early planning applications, but the land still had to be surveyed, and the plans were deposited with the Surrey Clerk of the Peace. We hold hundreds of them, covering the period 1789 to 1982, from the Basingstoke Canal to the M25. This one, drawn up to show the ground plan of the intended South London waterworks at Kennington in 1832, shows the trees that provided both shade and privacy in Cumberland and Vauxhall Gardens in the late 18th century. Although the spring gardens at Vauxhall had been open since the late 17th century, their immense popularity really took off under Jonathan Tyers after he took over the management of the venue in 1729. Popular periodicals of the day, such as Appleby's Journal and the Gentleman's Magazine, published poems celebrating the pleasures of the gardens on a sublime June evening, when luscious crowds travelled down the Thames from the crowded heat of the City and Westminster, to be unloaded onto the shore at what was then a very rural Lambeth, to discover the verdant walks lit by thousands of naphtha lanterns. Here they were entertained with music, a medley of vaulting, tumbling, rope dancing, singing and sometimes farces, and could regale themselves in the interval with eating, drinking, smoking, or making love to the ladies of pleasure. Though Lambeth was still pretty rural when this early planning document was drawn up in 1832, whatever charm Vauxhall Stairs might once have had on those summer evenings was now somewhat tarnished by the construction of a distillery, a wharf and a vinegar yard along one side. The nightingales, once such a feature of the tree-lined walks of Vauxhall, were now drowned out by the increasing traffic along Kennington Lane. You can't talk about trees in Surrey for very long without mentioning John Evelyn. Born in Wootton in 1620, he was one of the most wide-ranging virtuosi of his age. Friend of Christopher Wren, Samuel Pepys, Robert Boyle and Isaac Newton, and known in his own time as a scholar, garden designer and bibliophile, he celebrated the Surrey landscape in his published horticultural writings and also took great pride in his Surrey ancestry. Much of his family's fortune came from the gunpowder business. Surrey businessmen, like his grandfather, Sir George Evelyn, took advantage of their proximity to London and plentiful woodland for the manufacture of charcoal for gunpowder, to take up contracts for supplying the growing needs of England's Navy and Army. John Evelyn is largely remembered today as a garden designer and horticulturalist who championed the Italianate style in landscape gardening and loved all plants, be they salad leaves or trees. He was a founder member of the Royal Society in 1660 and was invited to write a tract on arboriculture as the Society's very first publication. His Silver, or a discourse of forest trees and the propagation of timber in His Majesty's dominions, was first published in 1664, and we have 2 copies in our library at Surrey History Centre. All aspects of cultivation and use of wood are covered, but more than a manual, the work sought to inspire people to love trees and create for themselves a paradise on earth. Evelyn was not the first Surrey landowner to love trees. This slide shows a page from an account book that was kept by Sir Francis Carew of Beddington in the opening years of the 17th century. John Aubrey later described the house in his History of Surrey as a handsome pile of a building, having before it neat gardens not yet finished, with several canals and an orchard. He also tells us that it possessed a fine orangery, where are several orange plants, transplanted from the warmer breezes of the Italian air into our more inclement climate, planted in the open ground, where they have throve to admiration for above a whole century, but are preserved during the winter season under a movable covert. This book, kept between 1603 and 1611, takes us back to the earliest days of that garden and provides important evidence for its construction, planting history and daily care. It's written in what is known as secretary hand and is dated the week beginning the 12th day of April 1607, being a Sunday. Surrey has a rich heritage of nursery gardens and arboriculture. There were several large nurseries in and around Woking from the mid-18th century. Their owners were attracted by the easily worked soil and access to the London markets. Goldsworth nurseries began in the 1760s when James Turner bought a small parcel of land known as the Tithing of Goldings from the Earl of Onslow and began to cultivate trees and shrubs. Early in the 19th century, the nursery was acquired by Robert Donald, who planted an arboretum, and one of his early catalogues survives in our collections. In 1877, the site and business were bought and greatly expanded by Walter Charles Slowcock. He'd worked in the nursery business from about 1860, initially for Anthony Waterer at the Knapp Hill Nursery. His archive includes detailed notes of horticultural matters, including notes on cultivation in Europe during a year that he spent working in Belgium. By his death in 1926, Goldsworth Old Nurseries had grown from 24 to 420 acres, and the name Slowcock had become well known in horticulture, winning many prizes for new varieties of rhododendron. Jackman's nurseries were founded by William Jackman in 1810 on 50 acres of land at St John's and sold by the family in 1967. We have their records from 1839. Their archive is extensive and includes these exquisite catalogues of the trees and shrubs that they had for sale in the early 20th century. By the close of the 19th century, Surrey was rapidly becoming the populous county that it is today. Jackman and his fellow nurserymen were responding to change, providing trees for small suburban gardens across a geometric patchwork of ribbon development stretching south from London along railway lines and improving roads. In this slide, we see a plan from sale particulars of the Albany Park estate near the banks of the Thames between Kingston and Ham. The plots are measured out and the roads are in place, but only the trees are shown as no homes have been built yet. Today, plans like this are very useful for garden historians, helping to date the large trees which survive in these suburban gardens. The borders of one of these plots were later designed for the new owners by Gertrude Jekyll. Gertrude Jekyll of Godalming was not just a gardener. She was an artist, photographer, designer and social historian whose work was highly regarded by her contemporaries and whose influence is still felt today. Her collaboration with Sir Edwin Lutyens is well known. She designed gardens throughout England, Europe and America, but she was also imbued with the ideals of the arts and crafts movement, and at the same time as designing daringly new herbaceous borders for the readers of country life, she resisted the onslaught of modern consumerism and metropolitan change by championing the simple rural life and crafts of her native Surrey. These clipped yews outside a Surrey cottage were photographed by Gertrude Jekyll in around 1900 and encapsulate her love of form and structure in even the smallest garden. The superb photographs of the county's trees that she made for her book Old West Surrey, and also for the Surrey Photographic Record, echo the stories of Surrey's life passed down by my grandparents. In this image, called the Woodland Lair, she conjures up the thickly wooded landscape across the Surrey Weald that provided cover for smugglers bringing brandy up to London in the 18th century from ships unloading their illicit cargo along the coastlines of Sussex and Kent. The Surrey Photographic Record was established in 1902 to preserve by permanent photographic process what is valuable and representative in the county of Surrey. Through Jekyll's lens, and through the work of her fellow photographers, Surrey's trees become characters in our county's story. Many trees marked ancient boundaries of land ownership. This one, near Farnham, stands like a sentinel on the edge of estates once owned by Waverley Abbey. And the famous crouch oak at Addlestone is one of our country's oldest trees, possibly marking the edge of Windsor Forest. Here we see the roots of a beech tree clinging precariously to the sandy bank of a hollow lane near Godalming. But ancient trees could also be found inside towns. This one, lurking on a street corner, was in Cobham. It was photographed for the Surrey Photographic Record in about 1901. But trees can also be scary, threatening characters in our landscape. This massive, bizarre hollow yew tree stands guard over St George's Churchyard at Crowhurst in Surrey. Reputedly 4,000 years old, the yew was recorded by John Evelyn in his great work, Silver. He described the tree as measuring 10 yards in compass, but modern measurement states 34 feet. Further recorded by John Aubrey in 1719 in his Natural History and Antiquities of the County of Surrey, the yew boasts a hollow interior space of about 6 feet, with a doorway and a wooden door. It seems that at some point the tree was a victim of the English Civil War, as a large cannonball was discovered embedded in its side during the 19th century, when it was converted into a summer house. Furnished with tables and chairs, the tree room suffered further misfortune when a violent storm collapsed the roof in 1845. This fine ancient specimen sports glorious swirling pink bark, which some say depicts the face of an old man sticking his tongue out. In black and white, it's all too easy to see Arthur Rackham's imaginative pencil at work in these ancient yews. Listening to the elm logs spitting and crackling in the grate as the autumn evenings grew cold in 1976, my grandparents would have had plenty of stories to tell about that as well.